delightful to be back in the West speaking to a group of woodland owners. When James was up here, I checked my records, and I gave, about 6 or 8 years ago, I gave a talk in each one of the regions about climate change and forest management. In Saulnieville, when we met there in 2015. I'm just so glad that James has come along and he's able to take over that portfolio. And I'd like to tell you about something very different than climate change and forests of Nova Scotia. I was going to make a joke because it's April Fool's and it's still before noon, but it wasn't going to work because I was introduced as Peter Duinker. I was going to tell you I was Peter Bush because Peter Duinker couldn't come. Well, it turns out that Peter Bush couldn't come. He is the old growth forest coordinator for the province, and he asked me to give the talk because he needed some end of fiscal vacation or something like that. And then I realized last night that my title could be misinterpreted, and I'm hoping that you don't misinterpret it. It's not a title about trees. It's a title about policy. Out with the old, the one on the left, 2012, in with the new, 2022. And I thought, if you thought that title was about trees, I got it totally wrong. Out with the old trees and in with the new. I mean, I like new trees, but this is about old growth. So I should, so what do I want to talk about here in a few minutes? Why is old growth forest special? Why did we need an updated policy? What was the process to get the update done? What does the new policy say that's different from the old one? What is in the policy for woodland owners, because it's mostly about crown land? And what do the next 4.5 years hold, since we're half a year now into the adoption of this new policy? So why is old growth so special? It's special for 2 reasons. We cherish old forests for probably a more diverse range of values than we do other stages of development of forests, and the fact that they're so doggone rare. And every time I turn around, I see somebody publishing the number that there's way less than 1% of the woodland in Nova Scotia in the old growth condition. Whether that number's right or wrong, you know, if you compare things to what it was like 500 years ago, we don't have much by way of old growth forest in the province. So about 15 or 18 years ago, we engaged at Dalhousie in a study with Bowater Mersey Paper Company, and we were looking at how the company might adopt a more sophisticated approach to managing old growth forest on its company lands. And one of the projects that we engaged in was looking at how people think about how old growth forests are important to them. 2 of my students, Joanne Moyer and Rochelle Owen, worked with me on this question, and Rochelle actually took people out to the Bowater woodlands and asked them, as they wandered around various types of stands, what they were thinking about with respect to how special those places are. And so we published a paper that basically adopted these 2 diagrams. And the one on the left is the one we found in the literature that talked about the various ways of categorizing forest values, meaning how do people think forests are important to them. And we found it to be quite limiting when we looked at the data we were getting about old growth forests. People had so much more to say about why the old growth forests were special to them than what a standard classification of forest values would give. So we know from our research how important old growth forests are to the people of Nova Scotia. So why did we need a new policy? Well, we had one in 2012 when Bill Leahy was doing his independent review of forest practices. Old growth forest came up on the agenda. Full disclosure, I worked with Bill and I helped Bill to understand some of the old growth issues. If I could ratchet the clock back, I think I might have made different proposals for recommendations on what Bill should say. But he said these kinds of things. In recommendation number 17, those kinds of things. Improve the abundance and conservation of old forests by doing a bunch of things. Implementing ecological forestry, we've committed to that in the province. Accelerated and improved data collection, the province has committed to do that. Rethinking these area proportion targets. Many people who know about the old growth agenda on public land know about this 8% number by eco-district. Adding old forest restoration targets, and then developing a silviculture manual for old forest restoration. So a team was put together. I had the honor of serving on that team with departmental people. We had quite a mix of folks when it comes to their skill sets, although I wouldn't say it's a very diverse group when it comes to gender balance and age balance, but that's sometimes the way it goes in the forest sector. Well, what did we do? We consulted heavily with staff of DNR. We had consultations with targeted stakeholders, the Minister's Advisory Committee, other government departments. There was Mi'kmaq consultation, and finally, about 15 months ago, we had a public consultation where the draft document went out, and we invited anybody over that 30-day period to chime in on their thoughts. And we, of course, we used what we could find in the research literature about old growth conservation. And we also did a jurisdictional scan to see what other jurisdictions in Canada are doing, and also a number of US states. So what's in the new policy that's any different from the old one? Well, of course, it could be updated to speak about both ecological forestry and triad, which we weren't talking much about back in 2012 when that policy was put in place. So old growth conservation fits into the conservation zone of the triad. It incorporates new science and so on, and it supports voluntary conservation on private land with stronger language than the previous policy had done. And I'll say more about that in a moment. There's a name change. It's focusing more on old growth rather than just old forest. And it strengthens the language around conservation of old growth forest on Crown land. Rather than giving a number, it says we conserve it all. If a forest stand meets the definition, which is much more elaborated in the new policy than the old, if it meets the definition on Crown land, it is de facto protected under this policy. And it's kind of like species at risk. We don't know where all the old growth is, but it's protected. Just like we don't know where all the moose are, but they're protected as well. The revised definition takes us away from the species-by-species approach and rests on the forest ecosystem classification that's been developed for Nova Scotia. And we made sure not to be trying to protect stands that had recent silvicultural activity in them, even if the stand met the rest of the definition for old growth. There's stronger language about removal of policy lands and compensation for old growth area removals. This to me is the most exciting and maybe the most contentious piece of the new policy, because the previous policy didn't say much about replacement of old growth if we lost some. And this policy says some very important things about the terms under which old growth on Crown land could be determined to be an asset you could lose. But also, what about what's required for replacement? And the replacement is kind of interesting from a private woodlot or private woodland perspective, because a proponent of a project that is commissioned or approved by the Crown that could obliterate some old growth on Crown land is required to find old growth on private land to the minimum extent of 5 hectares for every hectare lost. Purchase it and give it to the Crown as replacement for the old growth that was lost. Now you might say, that's weird, and is it even going to be possible? The point of it is to show how important old growth forest on Crown land is to the people and therefore the government of Nova Scotia. We should not be obliterating old growth forest on Crown land for any development projects. But if we do, it's going to cost heavily to find more land to protect. There's stronger reporting language and renewal language. So what's in the policy for woodland owners? The 2012 policy had some stuff in there for woodland owners, but this is stronger. It speaks to working with private landowners to explore mechanisms for their own forest to be recognized and maybe even protected. And what are the mechanisms to do that, including land trusts? If the Crown is interested in acquiring private land, it should include old-growth forest as a priority criterion for any acquisitions. Providing informative documentation and offering field-based workshops. And in reporting, accounting for old-growth forests on private land, but only if private landowners are willing to have that their land included in the reporting. So let's look ahead by the next 4.5 years. And why did I choose 4.5? I chose 4.5 because in August of 2027, the Minister of Natural Resources and Renewables is obliged by the policy to renew it. And of course, with renewal may come revision. So we're stepping towards that summertime period in August 2027 when that needs to be done. And doubtless there will be public and stakeholder consultation in the year leading up to that. The team is working on new monitoring and reporting protocols. We can expect publicly available reports from the Old Growth Forest Coordinator. There's some headway going on in conversations with private landowners and their organizations and trusts and so on. There's also coordination with Environment and Climate Change Nova Scotia on new protected areas. If you think about the protected areas agenda, it's looking pretty aggressive that the province wants to ratchet up the protection of land in Nova Scotia from 14 to 20% by 2030. And where is that going to come from? That's going to come from Crown land. There's increased effort by the department to find all the old growth they can, and various research projects on old growth ecology and other topics. I strongly encourage you to go to the website and grab a copy of the policy. It's in fact a good read, and I say that with all the bias I can muster because I helped write it, and I like it. I think it's a great piece of work. But you can learn a lot more, or you can learn about more than old growth on the website. There's a bunch of stuff there in ecological forestry. And Peter Bush said, come on, Duinker, toot your own horn. So now I'm going to tell you to go and watch this very exciting video that MTRI put together featuring yours truly walking around in an old growth forest in central Nova Scotia and waxing eloquent on why it's such a special place. While we're engaging in chatter here in the next couple of minutes, I'll leave this slide up, so if you want to take a picture of it with your phone, or I don't know how these materials are made available to the audience, but actually if you went to YouTube and Googled my name, probably that video would come right up. And if it doesn't, you should blame Jane Barker, because I think MTRI put it up there. So that's the end of my talk. I would have brought us to this slide just to remind you what we were just talking about, but I will bring it back on so that you can see those websites. Thank you very much.